Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and it's Tuesday, time to do the start sit video. Last week we tried it. I think we're going to keep it, and hopefully it will expand and just be better over time. But we are going to go through every single game and tell you which matchups are advantageous for which positions, and therefore which guys are you more likely to start in your lineup, flex, or just outright bench, keep on the waiver wire. And then there was also a request for a long shot, like sleeper player. And so there will be at least one guy on every single team that I will mention as a potential deep flyer if you're in a desperate situation. Perhaps you might look to them if you need it. So let us go through all of the games this week. And we're starting with the 6 teams on bye. We have a bit of a bye-mageddon on our hands. Week 8 is a bit brutal. So if you have any Arizona Cardinals, Detroit Lions, Jacksonville Jaguars, LA Rams, Las Vegas Raiders, and Seattle Seahawks, that is unfortunate. You have to bench all those players. And if we look at the matchup stats, there's actually some bad outcomes for wide receivers. Some really positive matchups other than Arizona would all be top 12 over the last 4 games. And that means the receiver position might be a little bit difficult. There is a really good matchup off the board for quarterbacks. Jacksonville has been pretty vulnerable in that regard. And then Seattle, shockingly, does rank top 8 over the last 4 games. The rank that you see for all of the defensive matchups is in regard to the last 4 games. It's only in that sample size. And then number 1 allows the most amount of fantasy points to that position, and then number 32 allows the fewest. So thankfully for running backs, Detroit is off the slate. That is the toughest running back matchup over the last month. But then there's also a lot of average matchups that aren't there, so that's unfortunate. It's a bit polarized at running back. And then at tight end, there are 3 in the top 10 that are also on bye as well. So that position a little impacted, but mainly it's wide receiver that does not get a big upgrade based on matchups this week. So with that out of the way, let's get going. Let's begin with the first matchup of the week. On Thursday, the Vikings travel to LA to take on the Chargers. And based on the Chargers' production lately, I think you are locking in Herbert into your lineup. He's been really productive. And despite his offensive line concerns, it looks like Joe Alt is probably going to come back. He's questionable. He was last week, but given the quick turnaround for this matchup, I understand why he didn't play. I think if he's ready, Joe Alt will be suiting up on Thursday. So they probably get him back. Perhaps right tackle Trey Pipkins will be back as well. He missed last week. But Hassan Haskins, the backup running back, was a DNP in practice on Monday. So perhaps it'll be the Kamani Vidal show, but based on the offense for the Chargers, I'm definitely starting Justin Herbert along with Ladd McConkey and Keenan Allen. They've been really consistent the last few weeks, and I do trust their production. I've been to 2 Charger games, and I think I trust Ladd and Keenan the most. I'm still not convinced that Quentin Johnston is going to be a lock every week. The upside for Quentin Johnston is pretty high, so I do have him in the flex conversation. And his matchup against the Vikings looked a lot more vulnerable last week, given the Eagles game. But they were previously the toughest defense at stopping receivers, so it could be a factor where one of these receivers really lets you down. And if I had to pick one, it would be Quentin Johnston. But given Keenan is 33 years old, there's a chance that the Thursday night game does not benefit him. Sometimes veterans don't play as well. They're not as rested on Thursday. So I'm still going to start Keenan. I'm still going to flex Quentin Johnston, but I'm definitely starting Ladd McConkey and Justin Herbert. I'm also starting Jordan Mason, who gets the second best matchup. These matchup stats are reflecting the last 4 weeks. So over the last month, while the Chargers started off the year really hot on defense, looking pretty good, they've been a sieve as of late, and especially opposing running backs have been diabolical against them. So whether it's JCM, Jonathan Taylor, or Devon Achane, those last 3 games, they've given up at least 2 rushing touchdowns to the position each time. So I would definitely be upgrading Jordan Mason. At the moment, Aaron Jones remains on IR. There is still no update. I'm not expecting Aaron Jones back for week 8. So I would be trusting Jefferson because he's matchup proof. Essentially, you have to start him based on where you drafted him. Mason is a good start. And then I do trust both kickers to be top 10, top 12 options. I would be starting Cameron Dicker and Will Reichert. But given the matchup is a little more difficult against wide receivers this week. I don't think Quentin Johnston is a lock in the lineup, just a flex play, but a still high-end option. And then Jordan Addison also gets a rough matchup here. If the quarterback downgrade to JJ McCarthy does happen, then I would be considering to just sit Jordan Addison outright. I do not trust JJ McCarthy to keep the offense rolling, and especially given McCarthy is a rookie essentially. Addison was suspended in the training camp practices. I don't know what their chemistry is like. JJ McCarthy has not been healthy since Addison got back from suspension. So he's just a flex option. His upside has been amazing though since coming back, and that's where I would still probably consider him in the lineup. If you're just shooting for upside, Quentin Johnston and Jordan Addison have a lot of upside. So the ceiling is probably worth it. And last week we saw a tremendous ceiling for Oronde Gadsden. He's been way more involved. And in terms of matchups against the Vikings, it is the easiest available. The Vikings are average against stopping the tight end position. So I would consider Gadsden a must pick up, at least as a backup tight end. And if you're really desperate, if you're really just streaming the position based off of last week with over 170 yards, I think he's a good pickup option. Definitely a priority claim off the waiver wire this week. But because of the familiarity that I know Jesse Minter of the Chargers has, their defensive coordinator used to go up against McCarthy in practice at Michigan, I could see an excellent game plan. I could see McCarthy have a lot of problems. So as long as JJ is the starter, I do think the Chargers defense is viable on Thursday night. But aside from them, I wouldn't really be trusting anyone. We have TJ Hawkinson with a roughly bad matchup. Assuming it's McCarthy, I'm not going to start him. He played much better than I thought last week, but that was with Wentz, and his connection with Wentz looked way, way better than it did in the first two games with McCarthy. So I will bench TJ Hawkinson. I'm also going to bench the Vikings defense. They had no answers for Philadelphia, and Herbert probably finds a way to light them up. So short week for them, traveling on the road. I trust the Chargers offense. I will be benching the Vikings defense if I can, but perhaps I do rank them top 20. Perhaps they're in more of a flex conversation. At the position, you only start 12 or 14. In general, though, I doubt I'll be ranking the Vikings in the top 15. But Hassan Haskins is questionable to play, didn't practice on Monday, so not going to start him. And then two players that qualify for the long shot candidates are players that I would be benching. However, based on matchups, based on circumstances, there is a chance, very slim chance, that these guys do offer tremendous upside. But in general, you're just betting on a deep shot touchdown or some level of vulture touchdown on the goal line at running back. But like I mentioned for Jordan Mason, the Chargers matchup is phenomenal for opposing running backs right now. So Xavier Scott does catch passes. Xavier Scott is kind of tempting as a long shot candidate. I'm not going to start him, but you could consider him as a top 40 option in the ranking, a long shot with upside. There are 6 teams on bye. Perhaps you're super desperate. But on the Chargers side, it would have been Oronde Gadsden, but based off his breakout last week, I don't think he qualifies anymore. I would consider Trey Harris as the next man up. He has been getting a few more targets, given Quentin Johnston has missed some time. But as long as QJ plays, I'm not trusting Trey Harris. Not going to start either of them. But those are my big swings you could make in a super deep format. Let's move on, though. Let's talk about the next matchup on the slate, and that would be the Miami Dolphins traveling to Atlanta to take on the Falcons. This game is indoors, so no weather to worry about at all. And in general, there are some pretty obvious candidates to be starting, such as Bijan Robinson and Devon Achane. They're both top 10 running backs. They're both great, and they both get really good matchups here, especially for Bijan. The Dolphins don't give up a ton of touchdowns to the position, but they give up the most yards per game on average from scrimmage to running backs, and Bijan is already averaging the most of any running back in the league. So Bijan's probably my RB1 this week. Most likely, he'll be at worst be number 2, and then that's not a surprise, but Devon Achane is also a lock in the lineup. Given the Falcons just gave up a shit ton of points to Christian McCaffrey, you know they can be had. So Achane's really the only reliable start in that Dolphins offense, and I would trust him. There's a weird vibe going on with Tua. The Falcons defense is pretty good in general, but they were pretty bad last week at stopping McCaffrey, and Achane is relatively matchup proof given his role in the passing game. So I would 100% be starting Devon Achane and Bijan Robinson, and I know Drake London was a little bit mediocre last week, slightly disappointing, but I would still trust him regardless of the spot he's in. So even though the Dolphins rank bottom 6 in terms of wide receiver matchups here, ranking number 27 the last month, I still think London is a lock in the lineup. Maybe he's not top 10, but I will be ranking him top 12 pretty much regardless of matchup every week. I think he is a lock in the lineup. With 6 teams on bye, I don't think I'll rank him lower than 10. I also love the Falcons defense here. We know that the Dolphins offense is shit. And if there's ever a quarterback that can throw 3 picks by halftime, it would be Tua Tagovailoa. He's looking really bad these days. And the Falcons are looking great on defense. Other than the running back matchup, they've been a bottom 3 spot for quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends. You can't really get much going against the Falcons defense. That's the main reason they're looking like a playoff contender right now. Their defense is much improved from last year, and maybe they'll still miss. Perhaps they'll be on the bubble. I doubt they win the division over Tampa, but anything's possible. They could bounce out someone else, and the Falcons defense is the main reason why they'll probably win double-digit games this year. I still think they are a 10-win team in the NFC. That might not be enough, but it probably locks up a wild card. If we look at this matchup graph as well, we do have a really good spot here for Kyle Pitts. I do think Kyle Pitts is a good option this week. The quarterback position also plays well against Miami. It does rank not only number 20, but last week the weather was terrible and Dylan Gabriel really cratered all of these stats for the Dolphins. So on the year, Miami actually ranks as a top 2 matchup for quarterbacks. So don't let that fool you. Because of the sample size, it's a little bit more difficult than it actually is. So I would actually consider Michael Penix a legit flex option this week. I do think he has upside, but he's also cratered in terms of floor several times. And because of the offense that runs it through Bijan and Algier, I don't think Penix is going to be a top 10 quarterback in the ranks at any point this year. So I only consider him a flex, but the matchup is an upgrade. I do consider the Dolphins a good spot for him. But given it's also a good spot for running backs, I do think Algier as a legit option in this offense is a flex play, definitely on the lower side of the spectrum, but should see enough volume to probably carry him into the top 40 in the ranking. So with 6 teams on bye, he does have some appeal. And I do think Waddle is still in the flex combo despite his situation. A terrible matchup here against Atlanta, but I would expect the volume to increase. Last week, I'm going to completely write off based on the weather in Cleveland, but obviously you're not as encouraged after a rough game from Waddle, but he should bounce back. I would expect at least top 40 production from Waddle as a starter in the league. There's 6 teams on bye. I think Waddle will be a flex play, but I don't like this matchup at all for Darren Waller. It is the toughest you can find. And then Waller is also on the injury report. He is considered week to week with a pec injury. So odds are he doesn't even play. If he does, it is the toughest matchup against the Falcons here. So not going to start tight ends with confidence against them. I would be benching Darren Waller. Even George Kittle had a bagel last week against Atlanta. Tua has been dog shit, way too many turnovers, so not going to start Tua. Definitely bench him, if not keep him on waivers. And then the Falcons offense at home, indoors, is going to look way better than it did last week against the Niners, so do not trust the Dolphins defense. They're pretty ass. And then although Darnell Mooney actually had a decent game down the field, he does look good. I don't like this matchup. It does rank bottom 6 here against Miami, so while I'm willing to trust London, I still don't trust Mooney yet. I would be benching Darnell Mooney. I doubt I will be ranking him top 40, but he does have flex appeal. I don't think it's safe enough, though, to trust him. He's not had a good enough game in 2025. I've only seen him productive with the Falcons when Kirk Cousins was the quarterback. So if I'm not going to start him, I'm also not going to start Ray McCloud, who is healthy, has missed the last 2 games, but is coming back this week, already off the injury report. And then Ollie Gordon didn't do anything in an opportunity last week against Cleveland. I'm definitely not starting him against the Falcons. No thanks with Ollie Gordon. But my 2 long shots for this game would be the quarterback Kirk Cousins. Michael Penix got pretty roughed up against the Niners, and I could see him limited in practice all week. There's a chance that he doesn't play, but I really doubt it. I would expect Penix to be the guy, but given the matchup against Miami, if Cousins has an opportunity, he has capitalized. Last year, he did have some high upside in a few matchups. I would consider Kirk Cousins a decent flex play at quarterback if he gets the start, but I really doubt it. He's a long shot to play, so very much a long shot in your lineup. And then lastly, I don't think there's a chance I'm going to start him, but Malik Washington will have a breakout game at some point, especially if Waller is out. There's very few targets available. If it's A. Chain or Waddle, next man up would be Malik Washington. So he has some waiver wire pickup appeal, but at the moment, not enough unless you're in like a 16-team league. The matchup's terrible against the Falcons. I don't think either long shot is worth considering. I would keep them both on the waiver wire unless Penix is inactive. Our next game of the week would be the Jets traveling to Cincinnati to take on the Bengals, and the Bengals defense is fucking terrible. They are elite for every single matchup except for wide receiver. And last week we saw Aaron Rodgers completely torch them with 4 tight end touchdowns. So they are the best tight end matchup you can find. For that reason, I do think Mason Taylor is a high-end flex play in the streaming discussion at tight end against the Bengals. It's just a really good spot. And Garrett Wilson is not 100%. I think Garrett Wilson will play. He's been upgraded to questionable. Last week he was doubtful all throughout the week. And if he's available, he definitely will play. So I would still start Garrett Wilson. But I think Mason Taylor will have a good opportunity to step up, especially if Wilson does play. I could see added upside for Mason Taylor. He's had some big target games earlier on this season. However, I don't know who the quarterback is. While the matchup is amazing for Justin Fields, there is a chance he did get benched for Tyrod Taylor. That did happen last week, and maybe they're willing to go away from him. He would have tremendous upside because not only are the Bengals terrible against quarterbacks, but also at stopping the run. And I do think Fields would have elite upside in a good matchup here, in the run game especially. So I would definitely start Fields if he is the guy. We've seen him have 30-point upside. He's really matchup dependent, and I think Garrett Wilson leaving the offense was a big problem for him last week. If they start Justin Fields, I would want him in the lineup, especially in a super flex league. It's a no-brainer, but I do think he has tremendous upside because the Bengals defense is just that bad. So Fields would be a start. We're going to have to monitor his practice reps. If he's still with the ones, then that's fine. If not, Tyrod Taylor would be the guy. And for that reason, I do have Tyrod Taylor as my long shot. I would consider him a top 20 option in a Superflex league. There's 6 teams on bye, and this matchup is top 3. So Tyrod could be an interesting pickup off the waiver wire, but for now, I still think Fields will be the guy. And in this matchup, like I mentioned, they're bad at stopping the run. Breece Hall would also be a good start. So I'm definitely ranking him top 20. I think this will be his breakout game. I think Breece Hall will find the end zone. We saw Jalen Warren run for over 100 yards. Breece probably does that. He's had several games this year with over 100 yards from scrimmage. So I think he's a start. Obviously a no-brainer for the Bengals. You're starting Jamar Chase. Joe Flacco could not stop throwing it to him. And I do think you're starting Evan McPherson as a top 12 kicker option. He's on the lower end of guys you can start, but with 6 teams on bye, the position's actually very impacted this week. I would consider starting McPherson against the Jets. I do think he'll kick at least 2 field goals in this game. In terms of flex plays, though, the Jets are much better at stopping wide receivers than Pittsburgh is, so that's why T. Higgins remains in just the flex conversation. Last week was great, but I do trust Jamar Chase a lot more, and the volume just wasn't as high. It was a bit matchup dependent last week against the Steelers. So given the Jets have much better corners, I could see T. Higgins limited a little bit. He's more of a flex play, not as safe, not as much of a lock as Jamar Chase. But last week, Chase Brown finally played well. He gets an average matchup here against the Jets. They rank number 19. So maybe he's better, maybe he's worse. But I think the main reason he's a flex play is because of all the teams on bye. Hard to get picky when 6 of them are out of the equation. So those are the flex plays. Mason Taylor, I already mentioned, gets a big upgrade, but can't fully trust him yet. I think if Tyrod Taylor was the starter, I'd feel a bit more confident. And then players I'm benching would definitely include Isaiah Davis. He's not ready to go. Noah Fant had a good game last week, but the Jets are much more difficult for tight ends than the Steelers were. Flacco had a good run, but I could see him throw some interceptions here. I don't think he'll be as effective as he was against Pittsburgh, but maybe you're willing to start him in a super deep format. And then the Bengals defense does catch a break because it's the Jets, but they're just so bad I still would not pick them up. I would still be benching the Bengals, no doubt about it. But I did mention my long shot for the Jets is Tyrod Taylor. If Fields doesn't get the start, the matchup is phenomenal for him. And then for the Bengals, Andre Yoshivas does factor in, does run routes, and does get targeted deep down the field. So perhaps one of those 50-yard connections does click for a house call, and there is some upside. You could get 12 points on just one play with Andre Yoshivas, but definitely not going to pick him up if I don't have to. Very unlikely I would consider Yoshivas in my lineup. But that's it for that game. Let's move on to this one. The Browns travel to New England to take on the Patriots. So this is a heavy defensive matchup here. The only positive matchup would be the Patriots defense giving up top 8 numbers to opposing tight ends. And given the weather's not a factor this week, there's only a 10% chance of rain, but not enough to care about. Harold Fannin, I do consider a good start. I don't think David Njoku will suit up, so I trust Fannin. There's not many targets to compete with him in this offense at all. So given its top 10, I would trust Fannin in my lineup this week. I wanted to rank him as a start in last week's game, but unfortunately he didn't get the job done. And this will come up later, but it is National Tight Ends Day on Sunday. I could see a lot of touchdowns specifically reserved for the tight end position. It almost feels like the league gives teams a quota that they need to hit at least one tight end touchdown per game. I think the league has leaned into it. So maybe there's a conspiracy that George Kittle is running along with Little Caesars, but all in all, I just think people are getting in on the fun, and I do think there is some correlation. Tight ends, I do think have a little higher upside this week, given it's National Tight Ends Day. So Fannin in a good matchup, I do want to be starting. And I think after last week, you got to trust Quinshon Judkins, even in a bad matchup. The Patriots ranked 22nd, so technically bottom 12 is a downgrade, but not as significant as some other downgrades. I consider Judkins relatively matchup proof. He sees so much volume. I know he was bad 2 weeks ago, but the Pittsburgh Steelers really shut them down coming off the London game. He was amazing last week, and I definitely trust him the most to be scoring any Browns touchdowns that they can offer. So I would still be starting Quinshon Judkins. I'm also starting Fannin, but it helps that their offense is really consolidated and narrow. There's not that many people that get the ball in Cleveland, but in general, their offense sucks. I don't trust their quarterback at all, so the Patriots would be a good start. However, the Browns defense is so tough, I don't consider any Patriot better than a flex play. I don't think I'm going to be ranking Drake May in my top 10. He gets a bottom 3 excruciatingly difficult matchup here against the Browns defense. They rank 30th most difficult, so I do want to downgrade Drake May. He's been good enough where probably you'll still start him, but I don't think he'll be top 10. I think he's more of a super flex high-end option, but I'm not going to bench him just outright. It's going to depend on who else I have, but I don't think he's one of the top 8, top 10 quarterbacks in this matchup. I might be flexing Drake May, but odds are you'll still keep him in the lineup. With 6 teams on bye, he probably still figures it out, but the matchup is a downgrade. He's not a lock to finish top 5 against the Browns. I also am a little reluctant to fully endorse Stephon Diggs, but if there's one matchup that's a little easier against Cleveland, it would be for the receiver position. However, last week he did bounce back with catching all 7 of his targets, and it's just a question of will he find the end zone? He's not really scoring touchdowns this season, so the upside has been a little bit more capped than I would hope for. So he's worth a start most of the time, but mainly as a floor play, just a flex option. I'm not going to rank him top 25 most likely, given the matchup is bottom 10. But Hunter Henry also gets a bottom 10 matchup, but it is National Tight Ends Day. I could see at home the Patriots still play well. I doubt I'll rank him top 10. The position's kind of loaded at the moment, but I think in the top 15 or 16, I would consider him a safe streaming option. In general, Hunter Henry is one of the safer tight ends you can find. But the Browns defense has been so good, and given they are a big downgrade for every position, I do consider them an interesting streaming option. Last week they were amazing, but the matchup was way better. I'm not dying to start the Browns, but I think you could do a lot worse. They are a pretty talented and well-coached unit overall. But players I'm benching, I know Ramondre had a good game last week, but not going to trust him against the Browns. It's a bottom 5 matchup. And Travion Henderson isn't even getting more than 1 carry. So not going to start him, that's for sure. Kayshon Boutte has had a good run, has had some upside, but not going to trust him in a rough spot against Cleveland. And then Jerry Jeudy probably draws the Christian Gonzalez matchup, so I will be benching Jerry Jeudy. I do not trust Dylan Gabriel to get him the ball effectively, so benching both of them. And then Jerome Ford does get some involvement, but not enough to trust. I would be benching Jerome Ford. And also, I'm going to bench Demario Douglas. He is very touchdown dependent. It happens so randomly. I would only trust Stephon Diggs and Hunter Henry. I'd much rather go Boutte than Demario as well. But players I consider long shots in this one are tight ends on National Tight Ends Day. David Njoku, I doubt will suit up. He's pretty unlikely to play. If I had to guess, he's not going to suit up, so he's a long shot to even be active. But it is a good matchup here, top 8 against the position against the Patriots. So if he is active, he would be a much safer play than Jerry Jeudy, and I would consider him a high-end flex option. I would still rather go Fannin, but I do think Njoku has legit upside. So with him, you actually roster him. So if he does play, you might consider starting him, but a lot of teams have dropped him given the quarterback situation and his health concerns. Njoku's actually somewhat available on the waiver wire. But Austin Hooper scored a touchdown last week, and randomly he does factor in. The matchup against the Browns isn't amazing against tight ends, but it is National Tight Ends Day, and Hooper does randomly factor in. He does piss you off if you roster Hunter Henry, and sometimes it does work out. But a big long shot, very unlikely it happens. I'd probably be benching him, keeping him on the waiver wire. But who knows what'll happen on National Tight Ends Day? Anything is possible. And let's move on to the next matchup, which is a rematch of Week 6 Thursday Night Football. The Giants shocked us. They did beat the Eagles, and the Eagles just weren't quite ready, didn't show up to play on Thursday. So I think we've seen enough from Jackson Dart and Cam Scatterbo to be trusting them regardless of matchup. I was worried about Dart against the Eagles 2 weeks ago, and he had a great game. He runs the ball a lot, so he has very high upside and a reliable floor. I think their offense is pretty legit. Brian Daboll has had some very effective fantasy numbers in the past in his respective offenses. This kind of reminds me of Daniel Jones 2.0 back when they won a playoff game and Daboll was the coach. There's a lot more swag with Jackson Dart, so it feels a bit cooler to be rostering him and starting him, but he is absolutely in the flex conversation as a high-end option, and given there's 6 teams on bye, I haven't seen enough from the Eagles defense to worry about. So they rank as an average matchup, top 14 numbers over the last month. I do consider Jackson Dart a very reliable play. I think I will be ranking him top 12. I am telling you to start Jackson Dart against the Eagles. I missed out on it the last 2 games. Cam Scatterbo, also a pretty reliable start. The Eagles defense has been vulnerable lately, but the main reason I think they were so bad against Scatterbo the first time was because Jalen Carter wasn't active. It looks like Jalen Carter will play. He did last week, and he's off the injury report entirely. So that could be a problem. Maybe Scatterbo does fall back down, but given he had 30 fantasy points 2 weeks ago against these same Eagles, I don't see a world where you're going to bench him. A big reason why they rank 11th highest is because of Cam Scatterbo, that Thursday night game, week 6. So I'm going to trust him. I don't feel like you can bench either of them. They're the heart of that Giants offense. However, the Eagles offense is just so obvious and predictable. If you have any of them, I think you are starting them. Obviously, Jalen Hurts is in your lineup, but Saquon, despite his struggles, I think you still have to keep in the lineup. I don't know if it's really this obvious, but because of the Giants rematch and how he didn't play well the first time, could they have kind of decided, like, we're going to make the Vikings game an A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith matchup. We're going to throw the ball like crazy. And then Saquon's just going to go nuclear against the Giants in the rematch. Maybe Saquon is just that bad, but if you drafted Saquon in the first round and you're still rostering him, given who he's playing, I don't think you can bench Saquon against the Giants. It just feels way too strange to bet against him. So although he feels like more of a flex option, the position is pretty thin. There's also 6 teams on bye, And I don't think you can get picky. I think if you have Saquon, you have to be starting him no matter what. But Devontae Smith, after last week, probably a no-brainer to start. The Giants are a top 10 matchup. And same goes for A.J. Brown. Gotta keep them in your lineup. I was wrong to downgrade them. They even showed up against the Vikings, and the Broncos were very tough matchups. And A.J. Brown did step up in a major way last week. Same with Devontae Smith. But it was at the detriment of Dallas Goedert. So Dallas Goedert is a very annoying player to trust. Right when you fade him, he pops off, and then right when you decide to lock him in, he kind of shits the bed. So Goddard, I think, is a streaky player, really touchdown dependent, but based on how that Eagles offense has looked and based on how he performed against the Giants 2 weeks ago, I would still be starting Dallas Goedert. The touchdown upside feels too high, and he was just way too good the last time around. So got to keep starting him. I know it's a bit frustrating if you bench him at the wrong time. It sucks, but I would keep him in there. I think he's scored enough touchdowns to stay in the start consideration. Flex plays, though, I'm reluctant to fully endorse Wan'Dale Robinson, but I worried about him against Quinyon Mitchell 2 weeks ago, and before Quinyon went down with an injury, Wan'Dale did score a deep touchdown with some nice yards after the catch. And last week he had 90 plus yards as well against the Broncos in a bad matchup. So I don't know what it is. Jackson Dart is just that man, and I'm going to be considering Wan'Dale a pretty reliable flex play moving forward. I doubt I ever rank him top 25, but I do think he'll be top 40 this week, and I do think he'll crack that flex bubble. I do think Wan'Dale is a safe floor play. Volume is on his side. The Eagles defense, I think, is hungry. They got embarrassed the first time, and I do think they can step up. This game is at home this time, and not only will Quinyon Mitchell likely finish the game, but Jalen Carter will be available for the entirety of it. So I do think they'll look better. Last week they looked pretty good against the Vikings and Carson Wentz. I could still consider Jackson Dart turnover prone, and I do think the Eagles are in the flex conversation. You can stream them and get away with it, but maybe you do trust the Giants offense that much. Maybe it doesn't feel that exciting. They're not a lock to start, but I do consider them rosterable, and given the teams on bye, I do think they're in the top 20 for sure. So they're in the flex conversation, but not a lock to start, that's for sure. And then players I'm sitting, although Theo Johnson has potential, he also shit the bed against the Eagles last time around. And if we look at this matchup, it does rank bottom 4, so a very big fade for opposing tight ends facing Philadelphia. And that's why I'm not going to trust Theo Johnson. If he can score another touchdown, then I will consider him a legit streamer every week. But a little bit matchup dependent. Last week was better for him. I am not going to trust him despite some really high-end outcomes. I want to believe that 2 weeks ago was a matchup that I'm willing to trust as a big red flag. So no thank you with Theo Johnson. I'm going to bench him. I'm also going to keep Darius Slayton likely on the waiver wire. I don't think he's going to play. He missed the last 2 games, and at the moment he's questionable, but not sure if he'll practice at all. And in his absence, Lil Jordan Humphrey has been seeing some extra targets, but not going to start him against the Eagles secondary. That feels way too bold, and I barely feel confident starting Wan'Dale and Theo Johnson. So no thanks with Lil Jordan Humphrey. I'm also not going to trust a backup running back for the Eagles. No thanks with A.J. Dillon or Tank Bigsby. And then Jahan Dotson has not earned enough volume to trust. And then the Giants defense played well the first time around, but I'm not going to trust them yet again. I don't feel bold enough to start the Giants defense. They're not going to be ranked inside my top 15 when they go off against Philadelphia. So no thanks with any of them. And then really I'm saying no thanks to these two, but players I consider long shots would be Daniel Bellinger, who has offered some legit value. Last week, another big game and a touchdown from him. It happened 3 weeks ago as well. He had over 50 against the Eagles. I'm not trusting Theo Johnson, and I'd much rather go Theo Johnson than Daniel Bellinger. So an interesting name to consider as a deep shot tight end in DFS, but otherwise pretty meaningless. And then Will Shipley, who knows if this is a blowout as we expected the first time around for the Eagles. There's a chance that maybe in the fourth quarter they just run out the clock with a backup running back. I really doubt it, though. I wouldn't be starting Shipley or Bellinger at all. So those are the players in this matchup that I would start and sit. And now let's move on. The Bills travel to Carolina to take on the Panthers. And if we look at these matchups, it is good for Josh Allen. He's always a lock in the lineup, so definitely going to be a good game for him. I would definitely upgrade him as a top 2 quarterback, no doubt about it. And then the Bills are also pretty vulnerable against the running back position. They're coming off of bye. Sometimes defenses really fix their issues over the course of the bye. So perhaps I'm not willing to trust Rico Dowdle as much, but last week he was much more effective than Chuba Hubbard. And given his efficiency this year, I would rather trust him in my lineup than Chuba Hubbard. I think the upside is much higher, and I do still consider Rico Dowdle a top 20 start. Obviously not as much upside with Chuba in the offense available, but Rico has looked good enough where I will keep starting him if I have him. But it's also a good matchup for Dalton Kincaid. The Panthers rank top 10 in terms of tight end fantasy points allowed. So I do think Kincaid, if active, is a safe start. He's been the most reliable target for Allen this year. However, he missed the last game we saw the Falcons play. He was not available against Atlanta. So as long as he's available this week, I would start Kincaid. He looks like a reliable top 12 option every week. And then James Cook is always a lock in the lineup. He had such a good start to the year. He started to fade before the bye week. The last 2 games were a little bit mediocre, but some of that was just the matchups, and I do think it gets much better. Although on paper, this is not a matchup you want. The Carolina Panthers rank bottom 2 at stopping the run over the last 4 games. They've been elite. So perhaps you're hitting the panic button on James Cook this week, but I think based on his touchdown upside, I cannot bench him. The position is a bit thin, and there's not much threat to him in that offense. Ray Davis is a big afterthought. I am not going to bench James Cook, but the matchup is bad. He's probably not going to rank inside my top 10, given it's such a big downgrade against Carolina. But the Panthers offense is not one that I trust, especially with a backup quarterback. It looks like Bryce Young has already been ruled doubtful for this game. So he exited early last week. Andy Dalton did take over, and I do expect Andy Dalton to get the start. So for that reason, I do think Sean McDermott's defense will look a lot better off the bye, and I'm not going to trust Andy Dalton to torch them. So I consider the Bills as a solid start this week. Maybe they're not top 10, but I do think they will be in the top 15 and closer to the top 12. So I do think they're a decent play. If you are looking for a defense, the Bills may have been dropped and available in a lot of formats, given they were just on bye. I don't hate this matchup at all against the Panthers, but players I'm flexing with little confidence would be Tet McMillan. The matchup against Buffalo for wide receivers is average, but with Andy Dalton under center, I don't feel like I can trust him. I'm not dying to start Tet McMillan. Even when he had a good matchup against Dallas, he didn't really capitalize. Other than the touchdowns, he's had a pretty capped ceiling overall this year. So not expecting the world from Tet. Last week, Leggett went off, so I will just consider McMillan a flex option, but is the safer option among Panthers wideouts. And then Chuba Hubbard was pretty inefficient on the volume he got. And although it was close to 50-50 with Rico Dowdle, he was behind Rico in the touch split. So it was like 55-45. You still have a decent floor with Chuba. However, he's a bit more touchdown dependent than Rico. Dowdle had way more upside on his volume. So I'd rather go Rico, but I do consider Chuba a decent, safe flex option. I consider him similar to like Kenneth Walker. You'd rather have the other guy. The touchdowns feel a bit more likely, but still you'll probably get a usable fantasy game out of it. At least 8 points is probably his floor against the Bills. The situation at wide receiver, though, is not ideal this week, especially against Carolina. Their secondary does rank as a bottom 10 matchup here, so I don't trust Keon Coleman enough. I would only consider him in high upside flex play, likely going to bench him. And then from a floor standpoint, Khalil Shakir is much safer, but probably draws the tougher matchup against JC Horn. So they are low-end flex plays. I think I'd rather go Tet McMillan, but they'll probably rank in the top 40-45. And if you need someone, you could put them in at flex if you're that desperate. I understand. There are 6 teams on bye, but players I'm benching, I don't trust Josh Palmer this week. He's also questionable to play. he probably doesn't suit up and hasn't really been effective this year, so no thanks with Palmer. I also don't trust Ray Davis yet. He did score a touchdown last time we saw him, but it was kind of meaningless. The volume is still not high enough, but I do consider him a valuable handcuff to roster in case Cook ever goes down. And then if Kincaid goes down, then Knox has a good matchup here, top 10. He would be an interesting streaming option. He did score a touchdown against the Falcons. He's the only tight end to score more than 5 fantasy points in a game against the Falcons. So that is worth mentioning, but very reliant on Kincaid missing the game. And then I don't like the matchup at all for Jatavian Sanders. The Bills rank bottom 2 at stopping tight end, so definitely going to bench Jatavian Sanders. And although Jalen Coker came back, it was Xavier Legette who had the volume uptick last week for Carolina. So I would not be starting Jalen Coker if Legette had such a breakout and he's a first-round pick. I would rather be pivoting to Legette if I was desperate. So no thanks on Coker. Let's be patient with him. And then I mentioned Bryce Young is probably not going to play, so I'm not starting him. Andy Dalton is also a must bench as well. And I'm never going to start a defense with confidence against Buffalo. The Panthers got to stay on the waiver wire against Buffalo. Definitely a bottom 5 defense against the Bills. But players I'm considering long shots for this game. I do expect Xavier Legette to be a trendy waiver wire pickup. He had a phenomenal game last week, and while I don't really trust it, if there's someone that's going to pop off again, why not Legette? He does have touchdown value. He has scored multiple touchdowns this year as well as last, and at the moment, I trust him more than Jalen Coker. So the matchup against Buffalo isn't terrible for wide receivers. If he does sneak into the end zone, I wouldn't be shocked. Legette is a more tempting long shot, but probably still not someone I'm ready to roster with a lot of confidence. You could leave him on the waiver wire and it's probably not that big of a deal, but he probably gets some bids in most formats. But I do consider Curtis Samuel the interesting flyer in terms of the Bills' long shot candidates. It is a revenge game, not just for Curtis Samuel, who was drafted by Carolina, but also for the offensive coordinator, Joe Brady. Both of them were in Carolina together, and it is possible that they try to flex. That connection might be on display. Perhaps Curtis Samuel does get gifted a goal line touchdown just because it is against his former team. So they don't face off against each other too often. I could see that be a little wrinkle in Joe Brady's system, but odds are you're not going to trust an ancillary Bills wide receiver. It's super random. It could be Elijah Moore for all I know. So not going to trust him. I'd much rather go with Legette, but that would be kind of cool if he gets a revenge game touchdown. Weather is also not a factor in this game. We're about halfway done. Let's move on to the Ravens and Bears game in Baltimore. And this is a must win for the Ravens. I can't see them having good morale if they fall to 1-6. So their playoff hopes are on the line for pretty much the next 2 straight months. They need 9 more wins in 11 games to close out the year. So I trust Lamar Jackson to play like his life depends on it. Assuming he's healthy enough to suit up, I would be starting Lamar Jackson, no doubt about it. He's always a top 3 quarterback in the ranks, but given he's questionable, hasn't practiced yet, maybe he doesn't suit up, but it's only Tuesday. It's still too early to be considering Lamar not practicing a major concern. So the hamstring injury might be a problem, but I still trust him to suit up. The season's on the line. I think Lamar will be active against Chicago, but this is a very good matchup for Caleb Williams as well. The Ravens defense has been atrocious this year, and although they are getting healthier off the bye, John Harbaugh has an amazing winning record. I would consider Caleb an interesting floor play as a start quarterback. There are 6 teams on bye. He's had amazing upside this year, and given the Ravens can't stop running backs or receivers, I do think Caleb will play well. So I have him as a start this week. I think he's in the top 12, but his upside has been a little bit capped in some games. He hasn't been very good at all in fantasy, but Rome Odunze has been a little rough the last few weeks, but before the bye, he was amazing, so I'm not willing to give up on him. I still consider him to have the best chemistry with Caleb Williams, so I probably won't be ranking him top 15 this week, but given the matchup has been so good, top 2 on the season so far, I do consider Rome a legit start. I don't think I'm going to be ranking him outside the top 30. And at wide receiver, even if he is a high-end flex play, I would still start him, but I expect him to be a low-end wide receiver 2. Somewhere around wide receiver 20, 24 is where I will be ranking Rome Odunze. There is tremendously high upside. We've seen it this year. You don't want to be benching him. The upside is undeniable, but not as safe lately, so a little bit of risk. I'm going to keep starting him, though. And then DeAndre Swift has really come alive since the bye, and it looks like this matchup against the Ravens is phenomenal. So you want to be starting every offensive weapon in general against Baltimore this year. I will be trusting DeAndre Swift. Definitely, he's been way more productive off the bye. So their offensive line is clicking, some good rushing upside there, and I do trust Ben Johnson to keep feeding him the ball. But I do trust Derrick Henry to stay in the lineup. I think there is some legit upside for him rest of season. And although on the season they've been a good matchup, over the last month they're down to league average. The Bears ranked number 16 at stopping opposing running backs. So I do think Derrick Henry has some legit upside this week, should have a decent floor. He is touchdown dependent, but odds are one of those house calls does hit. I'll still start Derrick Henry, but it's a really good matchup here for Mark Andrews, and he has earned your trust. As long as Lamar Jackson's the quarterback, I do trust the volume to go his way. So I would be starting Mark Andrews. The matchup is top 7 for him, so got to rank him in the top 12 for sure. Players I would be flexing still include DJ Moore and Zay Flowers, but they are a little bit risky. The floor has not been that safe for either of them. But if there's one that has way better upside, it would be Zay Flowers. The matchup is much better for DJ Moore here, though, so perhaps you're willing to trust him, but he's been very mediocre, not that safe of a play, and their offense appears to be shifting away from him. Ben Johnson drafted 2 pass catchers for a reason. They haven't used those guys yet, but I do think they are starting to move off of DJ Moore a little bit. So he was banged up last week, not the safest play. Zay Flowers, pretty boom bust. It's all dependent on the matchup, but if Lamar plays, then I'm going to be more likely to rank Flowers as a safe start. But for now, given Lamar's up in the air, Flowers just a flex option. And then Kyle Monangai is a flex play as well. There are 6 teams on bye, and he got a lot of volume last week. It was a bit of a lopsided game, though, against the Saints, so maybe that was the reason why. But this matchup against Baltimore is phenomenal. I would consider Monangai to have some legit upside if last week's usage does repeat. So definitely a good pickup off the wire, and definitely a name to consider. Could be in the top 40 at the position in my ranks this week. But I would also consider streaming the Ravens kicker. There's 6 teams on bye, and a lot of teams unavailable are impacting that position. So Tyler Loop does have some value, but odds are you're not going to be desperate enough to take him. I will rank him top 15, though, at the position. You could do worse than Tyler Loop. But players I'm benching, definitely the Bears defense. Not going to trust them against Lamar Jackson. No fucking chance. And then Cole Kmet is actually questionable to play. He exited last week with a back injury, so perhaps it is the time for Colston Loveland to start stepping up, but he has not done that yet. I do not trust him as of this point in time, so not going to start Loveland. Has not earned start consideration. Rashad Bateman doesn't get the best matchup here, so not going to start him. Needs Lamar to play, and even then, low upside in general, so not excited. And then Justice Hill, not going to trust him. I'm only starting Derrick Henry if I'm starting a Ravens running back. And then DeAndre Hopkins has scored some touchdowns this year, but otherwise not getting much volume. Going to keep him on the bench, if not the waiver wire. And then the Bears offense has been pretty consistent this year. They're the only team in the league to score at least 21 points every single week minimum. So I don't consider the Ravens as a safe play. They've been really atrocious this season, so not seeing the value yet. Got to bench him, got to keep him on the wire. Against Chicago, I still trust Ben Johnson, but players I consider long shots for this matchup. The matchup is really good for wide receivers against Baltimore, so maybe if it is a shootout, maybe they need that deep shot touchdown to go to Luther Burden. He has one in the past, and he also has a 60-yard game just 2 weeks ago. So Burden will have some breakout games. They are inevitable. I do like his talent. He looked pretty good over the last 2 weeks. I think he's talented, but not getting enough volume to trust. But it could happen, could get a big house call from him. So is an interesting long shot candidate. And then the Bears are pretty vulnerable at stopping tight ends Off the bye, I could see Isaiah Likely as potentially more involved in the offense. He dealt with a foot injury, was on the PUP list to start the year, and off the bye, I do think he'll be fully healthy and perhaps a bit more involved in the offense. So we know he has upside, but haven't seen the floor from him yet. So not going to start him, but on National Tight Ends Day, perhaps Isaiah Likely in a good matchup does contribute a bit more than we expect, but not going to start him feels a little bit too risky to trust at this point in time. Let's move on though. Let's talk about the next matchup. This is the Niners at Houston game, and the Niners defense is starting to look pretty good in terms of matchups. Everything is at least league average, but running backs have been torching them the last month. A top 7 matchup, and given their injuries, I doubt it gets much better. So Bijan wasn't as elite as we thought last week, but still looked really, really good. And I would be trusting a running back against San Francisco with decent confidence. But the Texans don't have a run game at all, so Woody Marks is just a flex play, but does have a bit more upside. The Niners are a top 10 matchup, so a little more enticing. I don't trust Nick Chubb, and off the bye, it looked like Woody Marks was way more involved in the offense. But players are definitely trusting for the Texans offense would be Nico Collins every single week. He has to be in your lineup. However, he is questionable dealing with a concussion. So if he does not play, you can't start him. But given the injury, I do expect a lot more practice reps and upside for Dalton Schultz here. The matchup isn't bad. Last week, Dalton Schultz was probably one of my best calls on the week. He was very low rostered, only 16% entering the week. And I told you to start him. He was ranked top 10, and he put up almost 100 yards, 9 for 98 on 10 targets. So Schultz is clearly the top receiver if Nico Collins doesn't play. And assuming he's banged up in practice, I do trust Schultz to keep getting targeted in this game at home. I would consider Dalton Schultz a safe start, but maybe just a high-end streaming option. But if Nico doesn't play, I would probably rank him in the top 10. I think the floor would be very safe for Schultz if Nico doesn't play. So those, I think, are the only two pass catchers you want. But the Texans defenses look so good. Even against the Niners, I would still probably start Houston. They had 4 turnovers against Seattle, who also have a good offense. I think Houston has earned your trust. They are so talented and really good on defense at forcing turnovers. That's really valuable. I expect a low-scoring game against San Francisco, but I am 100% starting Christian McCaffrey. That's a no-brainer despite the Texans ranking only number 20. I still don't care. McCaffrey is a lock in the lineup. And then George Kittle did put up a bagel last week, but I've been referencing it many times throughout this video. It is National Tight Ends Day on Sunday, and Kittle is the guy who pioneered this holiday. So I expect him to have a breakout game this season. He had a bagel last week, but there's no chance he's kept in check for 2 weeks in a row. He will pop off inevitably, and I expect at least 1, if not 2 touchdowns for Kittle in this matchup. So although the Texans are a bottom 10 matchup for him, I don't care. I'm definitely starting Kittle no matter what. He should bounce back. That's what I would expect. So got to start him. I'm also starting both kickers. I think they're both top 10 options at the position. So Kaimi Fairbairn and Eddie Pinheiro should be in your lineup. The kicker position, also a bit depleted, given 6 teams are on bye. But players to flex other than Woody Marks would be Jalen Noel. He stepped up with 7 targets, caught all 7 of them for Stroud last week. And if Nico Collins is out with a concussion, then he might even be a decent start, but probably going to keep him in the flex conversation. I doubt he cracks my top 25. And even if Nico does play, he probably doesn't practice as much this week, and I do expect Jalen Noel to get the majority of reps. So given he was productive last week filling in for Nico, I do consider him the next man up. He would be the only pass catcher other than Nico Collins and Dalton Schultz I'd be willing to flex in Houston if I was desperate. But given their offense is just so bad, I do consider the Niners defense an interesting streaming option. Robert Saleh keeps them viable, and despite the injuries, they are still playing at a pretty good level. They limited the Falcons offense pretty well, and that is much more impressive than this Texans matchup here. So I do consider the Niners probably in the top 16, and given defense gets competitive, there's 6 teams on bye, you might have to pivot to somebody lower ranked. So Niners not going to be top 10, but given the matchup, are an interesting flex play, an interesting streamer at defense. But Players I'm benching, this matchup for quarterbacks is literally the worst in the NFL. So whether it's Mac Jones or Brock Purdy, no thanks. I'm benching whoever the Niners starting quarterback is. Not a good start here at all against Houston. And then Kendrick Bourne gets a bottom 2 matchup against the Texans secondary. So assuming Derek Stingley focuses on him, I think that's probably what will happen. I'm not going to start Kendrick Bourne at all, but I assume he would lose some value if Purdy was the quarterback. His chemistry with Mac Jones is much better dating back to New England. But Juwan Jennings, not a safe start, still getting back to health and didn't play too well last week, so not going to start him. Ricky Pearsall still coming back from injury, might not even play, so going to bench him as well. Terrible matchup here. And then Nick Chubb, I think, has lost his job. I think it's official. Woody Marks is the guy you want in Houston, not Nick Chubb. And then I don't trust CJ Stroud. Really terrible upside, especially if Nico Collins doesn't play. And then while Christian Kirk has some upside, he suffered a hamstring injury late last week. He was out against the Seahawks, and I don't think he'll play against the Niners. So he could be an interesting flex option, but need to see him practice. I don't expect him to play. I would be benching Christian Kirk. Keep him on the waiver wire. But because he'll probably be inactive, and if Nico isn't active either, a player I was really high on entering the year back in the summer would be Jaden Higgins. And although he's been terrible this year, he does have 1 touchdown and is my long shot for this game. It can't all go to Jalen Noel and Dalton Schultz. I do think they'll take some shots with Jaden Higgins down the field. He's talented. They drafted him a full round above Jalen Noel. They'd like him to get going, but he just hasn't played well enough to trust. So I'd much rather plug in Noel if I needed a receiver. And then at long shot on the Niners offense, I do still consider Kyle Juszczyk an interesting breakout candidate. At one point, he will score a touchdown and have a decent game, but against Houston is probably not the best bet. He is hyper touchdown dependent, and odds are he doesn't get more than 3 or 4 touches in any matchup. So got to be super desperate. Not going to start him if I don't have to, but is in the long shot discussion given the matchup against Houston is only vulnerable for opposing running backs. Those are the only positions that don't have a bottom 10 matchup against the Texans. So that's it for this game preview. Now let's move on to another one. The Bucks travel to New Orleans to take on the Saints. In division, this is a heated rivalry, but the Saints are a good matchup overall and a pretty good spot for all of the main starters of Tampa Bay. A top 10 matchup here for Baker Mayfield, so got to start him. Don't care about the receivers' health. Baker is a must start. And then Rachaad White gets a top 15 average matchup here, so not going to fade him. He should play much better than he did against Detroit, the worst matchup you could find. And then Emeka Egbuka also gets an average matchup. Got to start him. He should be active, and with no Mike Evans, he's a lock in the lineup. But the tight end position also gets a benefit, so Cade Otton saw a lot of volume last week. He's a go-to target with Egbuka banged up. I don't expect that to change. Evans has a collarbone injury. He will not play, so Cade Otton will get a lot of volume, and the Saints give up top 12 numbers against the position. So Cade Otton, a legit start this week, could see a lot of volume for him. And then I also trust the Tampa Bay defense. The Saints are always a plus matchup. You want to be starting defenses against Spencer Rattler. So in division, they'll step up even more. I trust Todd Bowles' defense in a good spot against New Orleans. But Chris Olave has a very safe floor all of the time, and the volume always carries him. This matchup is also top 10, so he is a legit start. Definitely going to rank him top 25 against Tampa Bay. But I do consider the Bucks kicker to be a legit rosterable kicker, so I would be starting Chase McLaughlin as well. At flex, the matchups against Tampa Bay are pretty solid. So Alvin Kamara gets an upgrade. Kendry Miller went down with a torn ACL, so less competition for Kamara. I don't think that the Bucks matchup for pass catching running backs is that big of a deal. On paper, it does rank top 10 in fantasy. So Kamara is in the flex conversation. There are 6 teams on bye. So with this upgrade, I do consider him more valuable this week. And then Shaheed could have a deep shot touchdown at any time. The upside is tempting. In this rivalry game, the matchup isn't bad. The Bucks rank 17th in terms of most fantasy points allowed. So not a downgrade at all. Always some upside for Shaheed. He is in the discussion every single week around the top 40 receivers, but never cracks the top 35. It's always a bit risky with Shaheed. Juwan Johnson, though, gets an average matchup against Tampa Bay, so could start him with a decent level of floor and not be too worried about it. And then Sterling Shepard probably is a safer flex option given Mike Evans just went down. I don't think Chris Godwin will play, so given the receiving core is just depleted, I still see a decent amount of volume for Sterling Shepard. He did see the second most targets among all Bucks last week, but the floor wasn't as high despite that volume. His efficiency down the field was pretty bad, and then he also fumbled, so it was mainly just catches that led you to production. Otherwise, the yardage was pretty negligible. And then the fumble took away 2 points. So Shepard's not going to fumble all the time, but he is in the flex conversation. Replacing Evans would be, I think, the safest to be done with Sterling Shepard, but not going to start Evans. I mentioned the collarbone injury. He'll be out for a while. And then Chris Godwin is doubtful, not expecting him to come back anytime soon. But the Bucks offense is a juggernaut, so not going to start the Saints defense, definitely avoiding Baker if I can. And then Spencer Rattler is too reckless for me to trust, too many turnovers, and can also get vultured by Taysom Hill, so not going to start Spencer Rattler, definitely benching him. Also not going to start Devin Neal, but given Kendry Miller's injury, I could see Devin Neal have some interesting roster value off of the waiver wire. But Sean Tucker in the same boat, not enough volume to trust. Assuming Bucky Irving stays out, I'm not going to be starting Sean Tucker, only trusting Rachaad White. But two players that are my long shots for this one. Last week, we did see Tez Johnson catch another deep touchdown. So Tez Johnson for the Bucks could be a better play than Sterling Shepard. However, I think the volume is a bit safer for Shepard. He's been in the offense longer than Tez Johnson. But Johnson has more upside down the field. He could catch that house call more likely than Sterling. But I think the more appealing long shot would be Taysom Hill. At some point, you know that the big game is going to happen. There will be a week where Taysom Hill has like 3 touchdowns. And why not during National Tight Ends Day would it happen? So I consider him an interesting pickup at some point. I think he will factor in. And given the injury to Kendry Miller, he'll probably be running a little bit more behind Alvin Kamara. So he will factor in, but still getting healthy. Doubt you're going to trust him, but you know once he pops off, he'll be one of the best waiver claims. Why not get in before that happens? It could happen. The Tampa Bay defense does allow the 14th most points to opposing tight ends, so could be a long shot candidate. Might be more valuable this week than any other New Orleans Saint. Let's move on to the Cowboys Broncos game, and I trust the Cowboys offense so much that even though the Broncos defense is amazing, I'm still going to be starting most Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb is a lock in the lineup at all times. So despite the Pat Surtain coverage and literally the worst matchup on paper, the Broncos rank 32nd, I still have to start CeeDee Lamb. I just cannot bench him. I will keep him in the lineup. But the matchup is least tricky for tight ends against Denver, so I do think Jake Ferguson has earned must-start status. Another 2 touchdowns for him last week. He's not going away. Very safe start, given their kind of narrow offense in Dallas. But it's a revenge game for Javonte Williams. A very safe start. You know the volume is locked in, and he probably gets in the end zone against his former team. I think Javonte has a very good game against Denver, but you're always starting Brandon Aubrey. He's a lock in the lineup at kicker, so all of those Cowboys should be in your lineup. And then Bo Nix gets a top 2 matchup here against Dallas, so after last week, he's definitely a must start. A phenomenal game from him in the fourth quarter. And then Cortland Sutton also gets a break here with a top 11 matchup the last month against receivers. There's also a chance that Trayvon Diggs doesn't play for the second week in a row. So Sutton, a pretty safe top 20 receiver every week. Definitely got to start him in a top 11 matchup. And then J.K. Dobbins gets the best matchup you can ask for. The Cowboys last month have given up the most points to opposing running backs. So Dobbins, a pretty safe volume play, has been really efficient in terms of yards per carry. Usually good for 80 yards and a touchdown. I would trust Dobbins in the lineup against Dallas. But I'm also going to start their kicker. I think the Broncos kicker, Will Lutz, is in the top 12. So given 6 teams on bye, you could pivot to Lutz as a backup, and it wouldn't be that crazy. I do think he's a top 12 kicker in week 8. But given the matchup is terrible for Dak Prescott, I consider him more of a lower end option. The Broncos defense is a legit downgrade, and Dak does not run it as much as Jackson Dart. So that definitely helped Dart last week. I would still expect 2 touchdowns from Dak in the passing game, but it could be such a big Javonte revenge spot where maybe he does not share the touchdowns for Dak to capitalize. So he loses value. The Broncos are definitely a tough matchup, but still probably starting him as a high-end streaming option. Dak has been too good. I'll probably rank him around Drake May, somewhere around quarterback 11, 12, 13, somewhere around there. But George Pickens in a very tough matchup is just a flex play with Lamb coming back. He did not find the end zone last week, and that does cap his upside a little bit. There will be some rough games for Pickens. So in a bad matchup, I don't think he's an automatic start. Not going to rank him top 25, but probably a very high-end flex play. Probably still going to start him. Evan Ingram gets a decent matchup, an average spot here against Dallas. They rank 20th highest fantasy points allowed against tight ends. So he's been involved, usually about 7 targets for Ingram every week. So a decent streaming option at tight end. I think you can always do worse than Ingram. He has a relatively safe floor, but kind of cap ceiling. Touchdowns are a bit hard to come by in Denver for Ingram. But lastly, the matchup is just so good against Dallas for running backs. I do consider RJ Harvey more of a flex play than a streamer this week. With 6 teams on bye, you might be desperate. You might have to look to lower end options, and I do consider RJ Harvey to be getting a big upgrade in this spot against the Cowboys. So gonna rank him top 40 for sure, maybe even top 30. And with 6 teams on bye, you could definitely pull him up off the bench and get some upside. He did score another touchdown last week against the Giants. Players I'm benching though would be Troy Franklin. I just don't trust the pass catchers other than Sutton and Ingram in Denver. So no thanks with Franklin. And then I also don't trust Jaden Blue with Miles Sanders out and on IR. Blue got a little more volume last week, but I definitely trust Javonte to crush the Broncos. Not going to trust Jaden, not getting enough volume as of yet. But Ryan Flournoy is relegated to the waiver wire with Lamb coming back. Definitely not trusting Ryan Flournoy or Jalen Tolbert. And then I'm not going to start either defense. I don't trust the Cowboys in general. Their defense has been ass this year. And then the Broncos are typically a safe start, but against Dallas, it's a terrible matchup. I would rather be benching Denver. I trust Dak Prescott enough. But with 6 teams on bye, I'll still be ranking Denver top 20. So maybe you'll have to keep him in the lineup. It might be a little bit desperate at defense in week 8 with 6 teams on bye. But my long shot candidates would be Marvin Mims. If you told me that the Cowboys score a lot on offense, I wouldn't be shocked, and Denver will have to take some chances. Marvin Mims can score a deep touchdown any given week, so that's what he needs to pay off a house call, and without it, you'll get screwed. So no thanks with Mims, but is my long shot candidate, and I think the same argument applies to Kevontae Turpin. We know that Pat Surtain is a really tough matchup for CeeDee Lamb, so maybe he does get locked up, and maybe they do limit George Pickens as well. Perhaps Dak gets fed up and just takes a long shot down the field. That would be Kevontae Turpin, the speedster, who runs that route. So I do consider Mims and Turpin interesting flyers, but they need that touchdown. If you're not getting 15 points on one play, I doubt you're getting more than 5 on the game. So good luck with them. You're going to need it, but those are my deep flyers in this game. Some upside with the speedy wide receivers that run go routes. And then the Colts host the Titans, and the Colts are actually a very bad defense. Overall, they've been really vulnerable across the board. So other than stopping running backs pretty well, it's a great spot for quarterbacks against Indianapolis, but I don't think they can capitalize. Cam Ward is not a safe start at all. So I would still be benching Cam Ward despite a top 5 matchup for him. Maybe there is some upside, but I don't want to trust it yet. I need to see it with Ward before I believe it. And because Ridley is injured and probably not going to play, I don't think you can start him. I don't think any receiver really capitalizes either. So I don't think you can start anyone except Chigokonkwo for the Titans, and even that feels like a very risky option. So he is in the flex conversation. It is a top 5 matchup for him, and Oronde Gadsden did just put up 175 yards against the Colts at tight end. So perhaps you're willing to trust Okonkwo, but feels very, very risky to trust. I'd rather not do it. Mainly, I'm only trusting Joey Sly to kick a solid amount of field goals. He has at least 2 in every game since week 1, and I do think Joey Sly has some decent value as a streaming option at kicker. You might have to replace kicker this week, and Sly does have some value and is probably going to be available on the waiver wire. Few people want to roster the Titans kicker, but based on these stats, the Colts defense is not one to fear, and it does look like Cam Ward will move the ball. I don't trust them to score touchdowns, but if they are in the red zone, they will kick it. They've done that many times this season. So the only Titan I'm willing to start is Joey Sly, and then maybe Okonkwo in a good matchup is a good streamer. But otherwise, I'm starting all of the usual suspects on the Colts offense. Jonathan Taylor, a must start at all times, and the matchup is top 10 against Tennessee, so 100% endorsement of Jonathan Taylor. And then the matchup is pretty neutral for Daniel Jones. He's been a good quarterback this season, so with his rushing upside, I do consider him a start. And then the matchup is neutral for Tyler Warren as well. He's been a lock in the lineup, so definitely going to start Tyler Warren. And then Pittman has been a bit matchup dependent, needs a touchdown, but the Titans have been top 7 in terms of matchups for receivers. So also going to start Pittman. I think the Titans matchup is a no-brainer. Got to start him if you got him. But I'm also tempted to start a second Colts receiver, given the matchup is top 7 as well. And Josh Downs would be the guy, but did miss last week with a concussion. And a few weeks ago, Alec Pierce missed multiple games with a concussion himself. So it's not a lock that Downs comes back to the field. So if he does, I would be flexing Josh Downs. However, assuming he misses again, I could see another game like last week for Alec Pierce. Pierce almost had 100 yards receiving against the Chargers, which was a much more difficult matchup on paper than Tennessee. So the second Colts receiver is a good flex play, and maybe Pierce is still a good option even if Downs is active. Pierce has several games with over 50 yards this season. He's also missed 2, 4 out of 5. Pierce is a safe floor play in fantasy, but players I'm benching would include Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard. They're on relatively equal footing, and while I do prefer Pollard still, the matchup against the Colts does rank bottom 3. Over the last month, they have been a terrible spot. Just ask Kamani Vidal. He only had 20 rushing yards against the Colts. So not going to start them. Very low ceiling options in general and pretty low floor this week as well. So no thanks for the running back against the Colts this week. And then Cam Ward, like I mentioned, not safe enough to start. Ridley, not expected to play. Van Jefferson did have 4 targets last week, but so did Chimere DK, and they were both behind Elik Ayamanor in terms of the target share. So although Chimere DK did score a touchdown, he's an interesting long shot candidate. I would rather go with Elik Ayamanor. He's had more touchdowns on the year and did have 1 more target than DK and Jefferson last week. He had 5, they had 4. So my long shot for this game for Tennessee would be Elik Ayamanor. But because the Titans are just so bad, I could see this game turn into a absolute blowout. And if that happens, they might take a shot to try to redeem A.D. Mitchell. He is my long shot candidate for this game. But if you're telling me Josh Downs does play, then I would put Alec Pierce here instead. I'd much rather take a shot on Alec Pierce than A.D. Mitchell. But A.D. Mitchell does qualify here only if Downs does miss the game. There is a shot that they send a house call to him. He does have some upside. I doubt you're starting A.D. Mitchell, though. I doubt you're even starting Alec Pierce. Most people are still sleeping on Alec Pierce. But lastly, Amir Abdullah has been getting some volume in this backfield. Not enough to start behind Jonathan Taylor, but it is Amir Abdullah, not DJ Giddens, that looks like he's the backup in Indianapolis at the moment. That's it for this game. Let's move on to another. Let's talk Sunday Night Football. The Packers take on the Steelers. And I see a lot of offense in this one. I don't think either defense plays well. And we saw Aaron Rodgers throw 4 touchdowns last week, as well as 4 touchdowns in his revenge game against the Jets. Although the Packers are more difficult, I still think you should be starting Aaron Rodgers in this revenge game. I think he will be a high-end streaming option, so I do consider him a start in this game. I also think Jordan Love plays well. Both quarterback matchups rank top 11, so I do think Love is a streamer in the top 15 for sure. I think I'm ranking both Rodgers and Love in the top 12 in this spot. I see a lot of touchdowns, and I do think in primetime, Rodgers steps up and Love keeps up with him. So I would want to start both quarterbacks. I think they want to play well against each other. It's an interesting rivalry with the Packers Rodgers connection. And then the matchup is also elite for tight ends. I think you're starting Tucker Kraft as a no-brainer. He's the most reliable pass catcher in Green Bay, so got to start him. He scored a touchdown in a great matchup as well last week. And we saw Noah Fant score a touchdown. Tucker Kraft will play well against Pittsburgh. Got to start him in a top 3 matchup. Josh Jacobs is a must start every week, but the Steelers are technically good at stopping running backs, so a slight downgrade for him. That's why I think Jordan Love will have to throw a bit more. And then I'm also starting Chris Boswell of the Steelers. They usually kick a lot of field goals. He's usually a safe start. I do consider him top 10 rest of season, but the matchup for DK Metcalf is average. I think he does bounce back, does find the end zone. I would be starting DK Metcalf. I think that's a big reason why Aaron Rodgers looks good. Metcalf will play well. The Packers don't have a secondary that can stop him. So those 6 players I think are in your lineup: Rodgers, Love, Jacobs, Kraft, Boswell, and Metcalf. But then players I want to be flexing that I think have tremendously high upside given the quarterbacks play well this week. I do think Romeo Doubs and Matthew Golden have legit flex value. I'd rather go Doubs than Golden, but still both of them have value. However, I like the spot here for tight ends in Pittsburgh. It's a top 2 matchup, just like last week. The Bengals were an elite matchup as well. And I do think Johnny Smith and Pat Freiermuth will be contributing similar to last week. I could see a touchdown for both of them. I think they are interesting flex options at tight end. It's National Tight Ends Day, and there's 6 teams on bye, so I don't think they're locks in the lineup given they both factor in. It's hard to pick the correct one. Last week it felt like it would be Jonnu Smith, but then Freiermuth popped off with an elite game. So that is tricky, but I do think they have a big upgrade in this Packers matchup. McBride scored 2 touchdowns on them, and it was a top 5 matchup for tight ends all season long. So I think they're both interesting candidates. I could see touchdowns for both of them. I think Rodgers will throw for 3 touchdowns. So it could go to them. They are interesting options at tight end, but kind of got to feel a bit desperate to plug him in. And then lastly, I think Jaylen Warren is more likely a bench candidate than a start. The Packers have been elite at stopping the running backs this year. On the season, they rank bottom 3, but over the last month, they are down to just number 23, and it is a little less difficult against Green Bay in the last 4 games. But still on the year, a elite defense to go up against, so not dying to trust Jaylen Warren. I see a lot more passing than running for the Steelers offense this week. So not excited on Jaylen Warren. I think there might be higher upside for the tight ends, to be honest with you, but feels like you're still going to flex Warren if you have him. Lastly, though, I'm benching Kenny Gainwell. Not going to trust him at all in a tough matchup. No thanks at all. And then I see a lot of offense, so I'm benching both defenses. The Steelers looked pretty vulnerable last week, so maybe they step up in prime time with extra rest, but not ideal. That veteran roster, kind of hard to trust. And then given I think Rodgers plays well, the Packers have been pretty mediocre, I think you can bench the Packers as well. Probably more of a flex candidate given 6 teams are on bye, but not a top 15 option for me. Not my favorite start with the Packers. And then I'm still benching Dontavian Wicks. Jaden Reed is still on IR, so can't start him. And Emmanuel Wilson, not the best matchup. Not going to trust a backup Packers running back behind Josh Jacobs. But my long shot candidates for this one would be Calvin Austin. The matchup is pretty solid, and I do think Rodgers steps up, so could see a deep shot touchdown. He missed the last 2 games. However, it does look like he's practicing, and it does look like he is at least questionable and optimistically will play against the Packers. So he missed last week. That is one reason why tight ends were so effective against the Bengals. Austin is their deep threat, and I could see a touchdown and 40 plus yards. Calvin Austin has some upside, given Rodgers probably plays well against the Packers. But I do consider Christian Watson as a candidate to make his debut this week. I think he's been practicing enough where odds are this is the game they were saving him for. So in week 8, I think Christian Watson will return to the field, and he does offer some upside, but got to see him play. It's pretty crowded behind Dobbs and Golden. I don't think I want to trust Christian Watson just yet. So a big long shot candidate. He's talented. It could work out, but not ready to trust him. Not even ready to stash him. I'd rather go Calvin Austin if I was looking for a flyer in this game. So weather's not a factor, and that's it for this matchup. The last game of the week is Washington taking on Kansas City. So I think you're starting the Chiefs with confidence. The Commanders defense is not looking too hot. It's a top 6 matchup for Mahomes and the running backs. And then even the receivers and tight ends get an above average top 14 matchup on paper. So I trust Mahomes. I think in primetime, they're going to look as good as they did against Las Vegas. For a primetime audience, they want the entire country to know they haven't gone anywhere. They're still a legit Super Bowl team. So I'm trusting Mahomes. He's been the quarterback 1 this season, so got to start him with confidence. It's a top 6 matchup here, so an elite option for him. And then Rashee Rice had 2 touchdowns. He's back to full strength. Got to start Rashee. He is the most reliable pass catcher in Kansas City. So he's a lock in the lineup, a good matchup here. Definitely not a downgrade. And then not a downgrade for Kelce either. He's pretty safe. So I will be starting Travis Kelce. And then given his talent, I'm also going to start Harrison Butker, but has not been as good this year. Still a safe enough kicker to keep in the lineup. Definitely top 10. Overall, a rosterable kicker, that's for sure. But given the Commanders are probably without Jaden Daniels this week, I do think Mariota will get the start, and I would be starting the Chiefs defense with confidence. Given 6 teams are on bye, it's kind of slim pickings. I would trust the Chiefs defense, given Mariota is probably the guy. So I would start Kansas City. Those are the only locks in your lineup. Xavier Worthy has not been good enough, not consistent enough to be a safe start, but does have high enough upside where I'm still probably going to flex him. But I think he has the same value almost as Hollywood Brown. Hollywood has scored more touchdowns this year, and there is just as much upside with Hollywood. They're both in the flex conversation. But really the best matchup here would be for running backs against Washington. So Isaiah Pacheco is starting to get involved at a higher rate. I do think he's an interesting flex play. And then given Mariota runs the ball, he's also a super flex option. Whenever he gets the start, he's not a terrible option in fantasy. So you could do worse than Mariota. He'll be a super flex guy for sure. And then Ertz, given all the injuries in the Commanders offense, is also a flex play. Had a touchdown last week. It probably happens again on National Tight Ends Day. He should be okay here. And then JCM gets a terrible matchup though against the Chiefs. I don't think he's a lock in the lineup, just a flex play, given the offense won't be as good with Jaden Daniels. He also got vultured by Chris Rodriguez last week. That was a bummer. But if Terry suits up, it's also a terrible matchup for him. So given the Chiefs are just so elite on defense, it's bottom 6 matchups for everyone. I can't feel too confident, but if Debo is inactive again and Terry does play, then Terry will rank as a flex play given all the teams that are on bye. So maybe he gets healthy enough to suit up, but not healthy enough to be a lock in the lineup. A terrible matchup against Trent McDuffie. Not ideal for Terry McLaurin. A big downgrade against the Chiefs. But players I'm benching, I do not trust Jaden Daniels to be active for this game, so not going to start him. Maybe he suits up, but I'm pessimistic. I think Mariota will be the guy. And then Debo has been dealing with a heel injury. Didn't play last week. I don't expect him to play again. And 2 weeks ago when he was active against Chicago, he played like shit. So not going to trust him. It's a terrible matchup even if he does play. So no thanks with Debo Samuel. And then no thanks with Chris Moore or Luke McCaffrey. I don't trust them enough. I don't want a Commanders receiver if the starters aren't active. If it's not Terry, no thanks with anyone against Kansas City. And I'm also not trusting Juju Smith-Schuster or Tyquan Thornton with Rashee back. It's too crowded. And then the Chiefs offense is too good. I'm not going to start the Commanders. And then Kareem Hunt, I think, appears to have lost his job to Brashard Smith, but it was a blowout. Maybe Brashard Smith usage wasn't legit. I don't think you can start Kareem Hunt at all. I would rather go Brashard Smith. So that is my long shot candidate for Kansas City. Brashard Smith had a really good game last week, but it was all in garbage time against Las Vegas. However, the matchup against Washington is good, and maybe he continues to have a role. His role has been expanding every single week. I doubt he overtakes Pacheco, but I do think he will overtake Kareem Hunt rest of season. So a good pickup off the waiver wire, a long shot candidate. I doubt I'm starting him, but could do worse than Brashard Smith. And then lastly, Jalen Lane would be my long shot for the Commanders. He looked the best of all the Commanders wideouts last week. And if Terry and Debo don't play, then I do think he'd be the most valuable pass catcher, but not a good matchup at all. I do not want to be starting him. If I can avoid it, I would pass. So that is it for this video, that's it for all of the starts and the sits, and I am running out of daylight. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. We'll be ranking the position all throughout the week and then updating every ranking with the injury news on Saturday. So if you don't want to miss out, ring the notification bell. I will see you next time, and thank you for watching. Nice and blunt.